The average American scrolls around 86 miles on their phones a year, and that number keeps rising. We spend around 6 hours daily looking at screens. If you want better focus, you need to stop scrolling. And you probably already know that. The problem is that knowing this doesn't make it easy to stop. I knew that, and I still struggle with it, until I learned what lies behind that impulse. Today I'll show you a simple method that helps you understand that urge and redirect it so the habit becomes easier to break. Because contrary to what you've been told, this isn't a willpower problem, it is a regulation problem. And that's exactly why infinite scrolling is so hard to stop. With a background working in mental health and communication, I am fascinated about the stories we tell ourselves and how those stories shape what we pay attention to. So lately, I've been looking at the stories we tell about scrolling. We call it a bad habit or a failure of willpower. But that narrative rarely leads to change. When I looked at how I actually changed my habits and researched what I've done, I came across the HALT method. And it's built on a simple insight from behavioral change, explaining that lasting change doesn't come from fighting urges. It comes from understanding what they are trying to solve. And that is exactly what the HALT method helps us do. And it all starts with one simple question you need to ask yourself. But before we use the method and ask the question, we need to redefine the problem. And this is important to understand. So let's look at the definition. And we usually look at scrolling as a distraction, something that we do because we're bored or because we're lazy. But from a psychological perspective, it is accurate to see it as a form of emotional regulation. And you're not lazy, you are trying to regulate something. So let's keep that in mind, because our brain is always trying to stay in balance. And when it feels off balance because of stress or you're exhausted from work, something throws you off. Maybe you feel a bit lonely or maybe you're just bored. There is something underlying here. So that's when our brain looks for the fastest way it knows possible to stabilize, which it is designed to do. We have just learned our brain habits that doesn't really fuel us with the right kind of energy. Personally, I realized that my infinite scrolling was my nervous system looking for an exit. But the problem is that using our phones to do exactly that really doesn't solve the underlying problem. And yes, it numbs it for a while, but over time it leaves you more depleted. And then it makes that urge to scroll even stronger because your brain wants to come back to something it knew as good for it. And then this impacts your focus and it makes it harder for you to stay focused on something else than the phone. Which brings us back then to the question I said we were going to ask earlier. And the real question we need to ask isn't how do I stop scrolling? It is what am I really trying to fix? Or what feeling am I trying to avoid right now? And in psychology, this is actually what is called coping behavior. And to understand what that underlying problem usually is, we can then use the HALT method I mentioned earlier. Okay, so let's look at the HALT method. What is HALT and how do we use it? So HALT is a check-in that we use because before we can change the behavior, we need to observe it. And we do that by using HALT. And the method comes from addiction psychology and relapse prevention. And so it is built in a simple idea. When we are in a vulnerable state, we are much more likely to make a short-term impulse decision. And what I mean by vulnerable state, I'll explain. So HALT stands for H, it stands for hungry. A stands for anxious or angry. L stands for lonely. T stands for tired. And I'll go deeper into each letter. H is hungry, which means that when our body is low on energy, our brain's self-regulation, it starts to weaken. And impulse coping behavior becomes more likely. This is when scrolling becomes harder to prevent. Because when you're hungry, you're more likely to scroll to feel good. And then A for anxious or angry. High stress or emotional arousal, it increases our brain's threats and salience systems and weakens our prefrontal regulation, which means that it makes the mind become more restless and more likely to seek out distractions to avoid feeling like this or to seek out reassurance to feel better. And it does this through repetitive behavior. For example, repetitive information seeking that we feel that we are doing every time we scroll. And L is for lonely. And since humans are wired for connections, when we feel lonely or socially disconnected from people, we become a lot more sensitive to social signals and more motivated to seek out contact. And since digital platforms can kind of feel like they are providing this stimulation of connection, it can kind of feel like it is temporarily soothing this loneliness feeling. But it does this without really satisfying the underlying need. And since our brain is seeking some sort of comfort, it feels like it gets better by starting to doom scroll, seeking out likes, seeking out comments. And T is for tired. And when you're tired, your cognitive control and emotional regulation are reduced. Fatigue or being tired makes it harder to resist habitual behaviors and easier to default to passive, low-effort coping strategies, which we do when we're scrolling, because this is wired into the brain as something we can do to soothe ourselves. Let me just say that even if just one of these is true for you, your self-regulation is already weakened, making you more vulnerable to scroll. So this makes habits like scrolling, for example, which is what we're talking about, a lot harder to resist, especially if you're already struggling with the habit of scrolling. But now that you understand the method and the letters, here is how you can actually use this method. By the way, if this has been helpful so far, I'd really appreciate you subscribing. It helps me keep making videos like this. Thank you. Okay, so the system, here's how we implement it now that we know the letters. So the moment you feel the itch to scroll, or if you are already scrolling but you're now noticing that you're scrolling, identify the letter. Which one is it? And if you try to use willpower to stop right now, you are fighting your own biology. So instead, let us try to address the root cause. Identify the letter. If you're hungry, then go to eat. If you're anxious, stressed, stop. Breathe. Take some minutes to do that. Or maybe you should write a couple of minutes. If you are lonely, then call someone, send a text to someone, or go out and meet someone. So if you're tired, you aren't relaxing when you scroll. You are then overstimulating the brain. Put down your phone, walk into another room, and lay down, close your eyes, and rest. Focus on the breathing. Maybe you can put on some music. Just relax a little bit. Just remember that when you're tired, just even 5 minutes of darkness is more restorative for you than those of blue light from the screen. Remember that when you're living your everyday life, identifying the letter and then doing those strategies can be a little bit hard, but we can be a little bit in front. What you can do is to build defaults, because decision fatigue is the enemy of change. So if you have to choose what you want to do every time you feel the need to scroll, it is easier for you to lose that fight. But if we have built some defaults, we can rely on that to automate our responses. This can look different. But for me, for example, if I really feel anxious and I want to scroll, I could just do 10 push-ups just to get my body going. This will help me. Or I can sit down and breathe. You can also do this on your phone. You can just go into notes on your phone and you can just write down the defaults. Identify the letter and look at it. Okay, when I feel lonely, I will do this strategy. I will send a text to my best friend or to a family member. And you can put them on speed dial. So what I would recommend you to do is just to decide now, so you don't have to decide later. Identify the letter. Take out your phone, go into notes and write it down. HALT. What will you do when you find the letter? We don't really need more discipline all the time, because discipline is a finite resource and it kind of just starts to run out by the evening. So if you're preloading these responses, you don't have to really fight the urges. You will always just know what to do next when you feel the itch to scroll. And when we stop treating scrolling as a moral failure, it becomes kind of a data point. It is just feedback from the body. So the goal isn't necessarily to just use your phone less or to never scroll. It's to be more intentional, and it's to feel the need to do it less. So next time you find yourself stuck in that infinite loop of scrolling, don't ask yourself, what's wrong with me? And don't tell yourself, I am lazy. Ask yourself, which one am I? Identify the letter. And let me know in the comment which one triggers you the most. This may help the algorithm reach more people with the video that kind of would need it right now. And if you want to learn more about this, I would recommend you to check out this video. Until next time, stay curious.